She had always been small for her age, the kind of girl people automatically overlooked in a crowd or dismissed with a laugh when she insisted she could keep up. At just over 5 feet tall with narrow shoulders and wrists so thin her classmates once joked she could wear bracelets meant for children, she was used to hearing snickers follow her whenever physical challenges came up. In gym class, when the teacher called for volunteers to help carry heavy mats across the floor, no one ever thought of her as someone who could contribute. When the neighborhood boys carried firewood in the winter, they would laugh and tell her to step aside before she hurt herself. Even her own cousins, who loved her in their own way, teased her constantly about how the wind might blow her over if she wasn't careful. She learned to mask her frustration with a half smile, pretending she didn't care, but inside every remark dug into her pride, planting something that burned hotter every time someone doubted her. She had the heart of someone who refused to quit, but her body gave everyone the wrong impression. She knew she couldn't change the way she looked, but what she could change was how she responded. So she trained in silence, not with weights or fancy machines but with whatever she had. She filled buckets with stones and carried them until her fingers burned. She pushed her body in ways people never imagined because no one was watching, and she liked it that way. Strength, she decided, wasn't always about muscle mass, it was about resolve, about the stubborn refusal to back down when things got hard. Yet no matter how much she improved in secret, the laughter never stopped. And that might have been fine, just an annoyance she could shake off, if life hadn't one day tested her in a way that demanded everything she had and more. It was late summer when the event that would define her happened, a sweltering day when the air felt thick enough to choke on and the cicadas screamed from every tree. She had gone with a group of friends and acquaintances on what was supposed to be a fun hiking trip in the mountains, something scenic but not too demanding. At first, she hesitated to join, because she knew the routine. Someone would comment on whether she could make it up the trail, someone else would roll their eyes when she lagged behind, and eventually, she would be treated as the weak link. But a stubborn part of her wanted to go precisely because she knew they doubted her. She wanted to show them that she could last as long as anyone else. So she strapped on her worn hiking boots, packed her small backpack with a bottle of water and a sandwich, and joined the group at the trailhead. Sure enough, the teasing started almost immediately. "Don't worry, we'll carry you if you get tired," one of the taller men joked, and the others chuckled. She forced a smile, her jaw tight, and kept moving. They didn't notice the way her calves flexed with each step, or how steady her breathing remained while some of them were already sweating through their shirts. She had built endurance in ways they couldn't understand, but she wasn't about to waste her breath explaining. She let them laugh. The trail wound higher and higher, sun beating down mercilessly, and the group grew more spread out. She stayed near the middle, not at the front where the most competitive hikers strode, but not at the very back either. It was during a particularly steep section that things began to unravel. One of the larger men, a gym regular who prided himself on his strength, suddenly slipped on loose gravel and went tumbling into the brush at the side of the trail. The sound of his body hitting rocks was sickening, a heavy thud followed by a sharp cry. Everyone rushed to the edge, shouting his name. When they finally reached him, it became clear he couldn't move. His ankle was twisted at an unnatural angle, and blood ran from a gash on his forehead. Panic rippled through the group. The trail wasn't accessible by vehicles, and cell service was patchy at best in the mountains. They were miles away from the nearest ranger station, and the sun was already dipping lower. The others argued back and forth, should someone run ahead for help? Should they try to carry him? Most of them balked at the idea of moving him, not only because of his size, he was well over 200 pounds of solid bulk, but also because they didn't want to be responsible if he worsened. Excuses filled the air, fear disguised as reason. And then her voice cut through. "We don't have time to argue. He's bleeding. He can't walk. Someone has to carry him out." At first, no one even processed that she had spoken. They kept debating, their voices rising. She repeated herself louder, sharper this time. Heads turned toward her, and the same old skepticism flashed across their faces. "You? Carry him?" one girl scoffed. "You'd collapse in 2 steps. Another muttered, "Let's be realistic here." The sting of their words was familiar, but this time something inside her hardened. She walked forward, crouched beside the injured man, and studied his position. His eyes were glazed, his breathing ragged, but he was conscious enough to groan when touched. She assessed the ground, the angles, the safest way to maneuver him. They kept talking behind her, but she shut it out. She had trained for years in silence, carrying loads that seemed absurd for her frame. It hadn't been for this moment specifically, but in her gut she knew it had all been leading here. Strength, she reminded herself, wasn't about proving anything to them, it was about doing what had to be done when no one else could. She slid her arms under his, braced herself, and with a deep, steady breath, hauled him up against her back in a fireman's carry. The weight crushed down instantly, more than she had ever held before, but she dug her feet into the dirt and locked her jaw. She could do this. She had to. Gasps erupted around her. "You're crazy," someone shouted. "Put him down before you kill yourself." But she didn't listen. She shifted her stance, adjusted the weight across her shoulders, and took the first step. It was like stepping into a storm. Every muscle screamed, her spine felt compressed, and her knees wobbled, but she refused to falter. The man's weight pressed her lower, and his unconscious movements made it harder to balance. Still, she moved. One step, then another, then another. Each step felt like an eternity, the ground unforgiving, the slope relentless, but she focused on a single thought: forward. The trail stretched endlessly, and the voices behind her blurred into a haze of disbelief and protests. They had no idea what it took to keep going when every nerve in her body begged her to stop. They didn't understand that all those years of mockery had fueled her resolve, had given her a reason to keep training when no one cared. This was the proof she had been waiting for, not in words, not in arguments, but in action. And as the forest closed in around them and the weight bore down like a mountain itself, she carried on, step by brutal step, toward the possibility of saving a life. The first few minutes were pure agony, a weight so crushing it felt as if her spine might snap with every uneven step, but she focused on steady breathing, on planting one foot solidly before lifting the other, because she knew a single stumble could send both of them crashing into the rocks and brush below. The trail was narrow, the edges dropping steeply in places, and the injured man was not only heavy but limp in a way that made balancing him a nightmare, his body sagging against her shoulders so that she had to constantly adjust to keep him centered. Sweat poured down her forehead and soaked the back of her shirt until it clung to her skin, every muscle from her calves to her jaw clenched with effort, but she didn't stop. Behind her the others followed, still muttering disbelief, some calling out warnings, others urging her to let them take over, though not one of them actually stepped forward to reach for the burden. She understood why. They were afraid of failing, afraid of dropping him, afraid of discovering that their own strength wasn't enough. They hadn't spent years training themselves to endure being underestimated. She had. Every insult had been an extra stone in the bucket she carried, every smirk had been another lap she forced herself to run in the dead of night, every doubt had been another reason to build a body that could outlast her appearance. Now, as her thighs burned with each incline, she felt the truth of all that secret work. She might have looked fragile, but inside she was iron. Still, the mountain did not forgive arrogance. Her boots slipped more than once on the gravel, sending her heart lurching as she caught herself at the last second, adjusting her grip on his arms to keep him from sliding off. At one particularly steep corner she had to press her shoulder against a tree trunk for balance, the bark scraping her cheek raw as she used the leverage to push forward again. The injured man groaned weakly, his blood dripping onto her back, sticky and warm, reminding her that this wasn't just a test of pride. This was a life depending on her. The others were counting on her too, whether they admitted it or not, because none of them had a better plan, and the clock was against them. She kept walking, counting her steps in her head, using the rhythm as a mantra. 1, 2, 3, breathe, 1, 2, 3, breathe. The numbers drowned out the doubt, muted the pain screaming through her joints, until her world narrowed into nothing but forward motion. As the trail dragged on, time lost all meaning. It could have been 20 minutes or 2 hours, she couldn't tell, only that her legs had gone from burning to numb, then back to burning again, and her shoulders felt as though someone had pressed molten iron into them. Yet even as her body protested, her mind refused to surrender. Memories surfaced unbidden, times when she had been told to sit down because she was too small, times when she had been laughed at for even daring to try. Those voices, once mocking, now fueled her like coals in a furnace. Too weak, they had said. Too fragile. She repeated those words in her head, each repetition followed by a silent answer. Watch me. Watch me. Watch me. The injured man shifted suddenly as if trying to wake, and the unexpected movement nearly toppled her sideways. A scream rose from the group behind her, but she tightened her core, bent her knees, and steadied herself before continuing. The girl who had scoffed earlier shouted, "You'll kill yourself," but the words barely reached her. She wasn't carrying this man to prove anything to them anymore, she was carrying him because someone had to, and fate had chosen her. Step after brutal step she advanced, until at last the trees thinned and a wider section of the trail appeared ahead, sunlight spilling across it like a promise. Her chest ached, her vision blurred, but she forced herself toward it, knowing she needed even a few feet of easier ground to regroup. When she reached it, she carefully knelt and let the man's body slide gently onto the ground. Her arms shook violently the moment the weight left them, like strings pulled too tight suddenly released, but she refused to collapse. Instead, she pulled the strap of her pack around, tore open the bottle of water, and poured some over his wound while pressing her bandana against it. She had no medical training beyond basic first aid, but she knew pressure slowed bleeding, and that was enough. The group gathered in a tense circle, some finally helping with supplies, though their eyes kept darting toward her as if still trying to reconcile what they had seen. One of the stronger boys reached out. "I'll carry him now," he said, though his voice wavered, betraying nerves. She didn't argue, didn't make a scene, but when he tried lifting, his arms buckled before he even got the man fully onto his shoulders. His face turned red, and he quickly set him back down with a mumbled excuse about the awkward angle. Another tried and failed, and another. They all looked around at each other, embarrassed, until their eyes fell back on her. She sighed, wiped the sweat from her brow, and said simply, "Then I'll keep going." She lifted him again, this time faster though no less painful, because her body had already adjusted to the technique. Her muscles screamed in protest, but in a strange way, they also felt alive, as though every fiber of her being was working toward the same singular purpose. She ignored the bruises she could feel forming along her collarbone and hip where his weight dug in. Pain was temporary. His life was not. The path wound downward now, a treacherous descent littered with loose stones and roots. Every step was a gamble, but she planted her feet carefully, bending her knees, moving slower but steady. The group had gone quiet behind her, the laughter and doubt replaced by a stunned silence that pressed as heavily as the air. Even the loudest of the boys, who had mocked her most, said nothing now. Perhaps shame silenced them, or perhaps awe. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the forest was opening up, the sound of running water reaching her ears, a stream, she realized, which meant they were closer to the base than before. Hope flickered inside her chest, small but steady. She clung to it, let it guide her steps when the pain threatened to overwhelm. The man groaned again, louder this time, and she felt a surge of relief. He was still conscious enough to respond, which meant he hadn't slipped into something worse. She adjusted her grip and whispered, though he probably couldn't hear, "Stay with me. Just stay with me a little longer." Her words were as much for herself as for him. By the time they reached the stream, her body was trembling uncontrollably, her vision swimming at the edges, but she kept her balance and crossed the rocks carefully, the others trailing behind nervously as if afraid she might finally collapse. She didn't. She refused. On the far side, she paused long enough to take a few gulps of water and then pressed forward again, driven by the knowledge that they were getting closer. The air felt cooler, fresher, and she could sense the trail sloping downward toward civilization. Relief mingled with exhaustion, but she didn't let herself celebrate yet. There was still too far to go, still too much at stake. Her pace slowed, each step deliberate, but the fact that she was still standing at all was enough to silence any remaining doubts from the others. They followed quietly now, their earlier arrogance stripped away, leaving only respect. Her body was no longer simply tired, it had entered a place she had never known before, where every nerve seemed raw, every joint begged for release, yet somehow her legs kept obeying her, were like soldiers marching past the point of collapse, and she realized with a kind of detached or that sheer determination was all that separated her from the ground, because physically she should not have been able to go on. Her vision wavered, sometimes dimming at the edges so that the trail seemed to sway beneath her, and she would blink hard to bring it back into focus, because one moment of dizziness could mean tumbling down with him and undoing everything. The air smelled of pine and earth and sweat, thick in her lungs, but she used it as a rhythm, inhaling when she lifted one foot, exhaling when she planted the other, an unbroken cycle that kept her tethered to forward motion. Behind her, the group had fallen completely silent, no more jokes, no more protests, only the sound of their footsteps following in uneven patterns, as though they were unsure how to place themselves in a story that had left them behind. They had thought her small frame was a limitation, now it was a revelation, because she carried more than weight, she carried a defiance that none of them possessed, and they could only watch. The injured man was heavier than anything she had ever trained with, his body shifting unpredictably against her shoulders, sometimes pressing into her chest so she struggled to breathe, sometimes slipping low enough that she had to wrench her arms upward to hoist him again. But every time she adjusted, every time she found a new balance point, her resolve hardened further. She began to think of herself as a bridge, a human bridge between death and survival, and bridges don't stop halfway across a river. Bridges hold. As the trail twisted downward, roots clawed across the dirt like traps waiting to catch her boots. Twice she stumbled, knees buckling, and both times she thought she was finished, but somehow she caught herself, gasping, clutching the man tighter, digging her toes into the earth like claws until she steadied. One boy behind her cried out, ready to rush forward, but she shook her head sharply without looking back, commanding silence, because if they tried to take him now they would drop him. She had entered a rhythm no one else could understand, one built from years of being underestimated, a rhythm that thrived on proving everyone wrong, and if she let them break it she might never recover it. Her back throbbed, her shoulders burned, her collarbone felt as though it was splintering under the pressure, but in her mind she repeated a single truth: he is alive because I am still moving. That thought drowned out the pain. That thought was enough. She remembered nights as a child when she had lain awake, furious at how easily others dismissed her, and she realized that all that anger had been fuel, a secret reservoir of energy that she was drawing from now, a reservoir so deep it seemed endless. Every time she thought she had reached her breaking point, she discovered a little more hidden strength, just enough for one more step, one more bend in the trail, one more surge forward. She realized then that strength isn't something you see, it's something you summon. Eventually, the silence of the group broke, but not with laughter or doubt. Instead, it was with murmurs of astonishment, words whispered like prayers. "How is she still walking?" one said. "She's carrying more than double her weight," another whispered. She heard it but did not respond, because she wasn't doing this for their praise. Still, the sound of their changed tone gave her a strange comfort, as though she had dragged them two into this struggle, forced them to see something they had refused to see before. The trail narrowed again, pressing between jagged rocks that jutted like teeth, and she turned sideways to squeeze through, careful not to slam him against the stone. Each maneuver cost more energy than she had, but she refused to let herself calculate how much farther there was to go. Distance was irrelevant. Only the next step mattered. She kept her eyes fixed on the dirt in front of her boots, not looking ahead lest the endlessness break her spirit. Sweat dripped into her eyes until the world blurred salty and hot, but she didn't pause to wipe it away. Her arms trembled violently now, so much that her teeth rattled with every step, but she grit them until her jaw ached. The sound of rushing water grew louder, and then voices, real voices, not from her group but from farther down the trail. At first she thought she was hallucinating, but as she stumbled forward the noise grew clearer, and she realized there were other hikers ahead, perhaps close to the base. A surge of relief almost dropped her to her knees. Help was near. When the strangers came into view, a pair of middle-aged hikers with walking sticks, their eyes widened as they saw her staggering forward with a body slung across her shoulders. They rushed toward her, hands outstretched, voices raised in alarm. "My God, what happened?" one shouted. "He's hurt, we need help," she rasped, her voice hoarse from strain, but she didn't stop walking, because if she let herself pause she might never move again. The strangers quickly assessed, one pulling out a phone, the other trying to steady her by touching her arm, but she shook him off gently. "I can do it," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. They nodded, perhaps recognizing the fire in her eyes, and hurried ahead, promising to alert the ranger station. The group behind her picked up speed, energized by the prospect of help, but she kept her pace steady, unwilling to risk a fall now. The man on her shoulders stirred again, murmuring incoherent words, and she felt his warm breath against her neck. It was enough to remind her why she hadn't quit. Each step now felt both heavier and lighter, heavier because her body was collapsing, lighter because the end was finally real, not just a distant hope. She pushed on, her legs wooden, her back bent, her breath rasping like sandpaper. And then, through the blur of trees, she saw the wooden sign of the trailhead, sunlight glinting off it like a beacon. She almost laughed, almost cried, but all she did was lower her head and take the last few steps, because until his body was safe on solid ground she would not let herself break. When she finally stepped off the narrow dirt trail and onto the flat gravel of the trailhead clearing, the world seemed to tilt around her, her legs wobbling as if the ground had turned to water, and for a second she thought she might collapse before she could set him down. But then she drew one last breath that tasted like fire in her lungs and lowered him carefully onto the earth, easing his body down so gently it was almost ceremonial, as though all the weight of her journey was being released with him, and the moment his shoulders touched the gravel, her arms gave out completely, shaking so violently she had to clench her fists to keep them from seizing. The others surged around, some kneeling to check his pulse, others fumbling with their phones, but she staggered back on her heels, pressing her palms to her thighs, her head bowed as sweat dripped freely onto the dirt. Her vision swam, the edges of the world shimmering, but she refused to collapse. Not yet. Not while strangers were now rushing forward, two park rangers in uniform who had been alerted by the hikers ahead, carrying medical kits and radios crackling with static. They dropped beside the injured man, their practiced hands checking his breathing, his pulse, his wounds, speaking in clipped, calm tones. One looked up sharply. "You carried him all the way down?" he asked, disbelief etched into his weathered face. She nodded once, unable to speak without her throat closing. His eyebrows lifted, and for a heartbeat his professional mask slipped, revealing raw astonishment. "You saved his life," he said simply. Those words pierced her more deeply than any of the insults she had carried all her life. She felt something tighten in her chest, a knot of pride and grief and exhaustion all tangled together, and for the first time since she had lifted him, tears slipped hot and unbidden down her cheeks. She wiped them away roughly, unwilling to show weakness now, but the others had seen, and their silence was heavy with something new, something closer to reverence than mockery. The man she had carried groaned again as the Rangers worked, his eyes fluttering open briefly, and he whispered something incoherent before slipping back into semi-consciousness. They stabilized his ankle, bandaged his head, and prepared a stretcher to carry him the rest of the way to the waiting vehicle down the service road. She watched all of it from a few feet away, too drained to help, her hands trembling as though invisible tremors ran through her veins. One of her so-called friends, the very girl who had scoffed that she would collapse in 2 steps, approached her hesitantly, as if unsure how to even begin. I didn't think you could," she stammered, eyes wide and voice small. For once, the laughter was gone. For once, there was no smugness. Only shame. She looked at her, and though she wanted to lash out, to pour years of hurt into words sharp enough to wound, she found she didn't need to. The silence between them was punishment enough. Another boy, the loudest mocker of all, muttered under his breath, "Guess we were wrong." He couldn't meet her eyes. She let them stew in their guilt, because it wasn't validation she wanted, it was recognition of the truth she had always known. Strength wasn't something measured in inches of muscle or pounds on a barbell. It was what you did when everyone else froze. The Rangers loaded the injured man onto the stretcher, their movements efficient and steady, but before they carried him away one of them turned back toward her. "His stable now," he said firmly. "If you hadn't carried him down, he wouldn't have made it. You bought us the time we needed." His words struck like thunder, final and undeniable. The others shifted uncomfortably, their shame magnified, but she didn't gloat. She only nodded faintly, her body still trembling, every muscle screaming in protest. One ranger placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle but solid. "Get some water, sit down before you fall down," he advised, his tone softening. She sank onto a nearby rock, her whole body sighing with the relief of being still at last, though her chest still rose and fell in heaving breaths. The stretcher team started down the service road toward the ambulance, and she watched them go, her heart pounding with something she couldn't name, part exhaustion, part triumph, part disbelief that she had truly done it. The group lingered around her awkwardly, unsure of what to say, their earlier bravado stripped bare. One offered her a bottle of water, another a protein bar, and though their gestures were clumsy, they were at least sincere. She accepted the water, drinking deeply until her throat no longer felt like sandpaper. For the first time she let her gaze travel across their faces, one by one, and she saw what she had always wanted, not pity, not dismissal, but respect. She didn't need their words, it was in their eyes. And it was enough. She leaned back against the rock, her body trembling with the aftershocks of exertion, and allowed herself to breathe without counting steps, to exist without carrying the world on her back. But even in that moment of stillness, her mind replayed every second of the climb, every brutal step, every moment when she had almost faltered, and she realized how fine the line had been between failure and success. She thought of what might have happened if she had stumbled on the rocks, if she had fallen into the stream, if her body had given out entirely. It could so easily have ended in disaster, and yet it hadn't. Why? Because she hadn't let it. Because when the world told her she couldn't, she answered with action instead of words. That knowledge was more powerful than any praise they could give her. It was hers alone, and it would never leave her. When the Rangers finally signaled that the ambulance had departed safely with the injured man, the group began to gather their things, subdued and quiet, no longer treating the day like a carefree adventure. They walked back toward the parking lot together, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Where before there had been jokes and laughter at her expense, now there was only silence broken by occasional glances in her direction. She didn't mind. The silence spoke volumes. At the edge of the lot, one of them finally broke it. "You carried him almost 400 pounds worth of dead weight out of there," he said softly, almost reverently. "I don't know how you did it." She looked at him, at all of them, and for the first time in her life she let the smallest of smiles slip onto her lips, not bitter, not mocking, but quiet and sure. "Because I had to," she said simply. And with those words, she turned away, knowing she would never be underestimated again. The days that followed passed in a strange haze, her body aching in places she hadn't even known could hurt, her shoulders mottled with deep bruises where the man's weight had pressed into bone, her legs so stiff that even climbing the stairs to her bedroom felt like scaling another mountain. But beneath the exhaustion there was a fire that wouldn't go out, the knowledge of what she had done. Not told, not imagined, but truly done. And every time she replayed those endless steps in her head she felt both disbelief and pride, as though she were reliving a story that belonged to someone else, yet the soreness in her muscles reminded her it was hers alone. She visited the hospital 2 days after the hike, unsure if she even wanted to see the man she had carried, but some quiet voice inside told her she needed to, if only to prove to herself it hadn't all been some fever dream. When she arrived, the sterile halls smelled of antiseptic, and the rhythmic beeping of monitors filled the air, and there he was, lying in a bed with his head bandaged and his ankle elevated in a cast, looking smaller somehow, stripped of the bulk and swagger he usually carried. His eyes lit weakly when he saw her, and though his voice was hoarse, he managed to say, "You saved me." He reached for her hand, squeezing it with surprising strength, and for once he didn't laugh, didn't boast, didn't mock, he only looked at her with raw gratitude that pierced deeper than any apology could. She sat with him for a while, listening as he recounted the fragments he remembered, the slip on the gravel, the pain, the fading in and out of consciousness, the vague sense of being lifted when he thought he was doomed. "I thought it was a dream," he whispered. "That someone bigger, stronger, carried me. But it was you." She didn't know what to say, so she only squeezed his hand back, letting silence hold the truth. When she finally left the room, she noticed the nurses and even the doctor watching her with curiosity. Word had already spread through the hospital, whispers of the girl who had carried nearly 400 pounds of dead weight down a mountain. She flushed under their stares, not used to being seen in this new light, but part of her stood taller, shoulders squared despite the ache. By the end of the week, the story had traveled further than she expected. Friends told friends, neighbors told neighbors, and soon people she barely knew were stopping her at the grocery store or on the street, saying they had heard what she had done. At first, the attention embarrassed her. She had lived her whole life being invisible or underestimated, and the sudden reversal felt unnatural, as though she were being shoved into a spotlight she hadn't asked for. But as the days went on, she began to realize something important. It wasn't about fame, it wasn't about people finally recognizing her worth, it was about proving to herself that she had always been capable. The world's opinion was just catching up to what she had always known deep down. When she went to her usual park to train, hauling her makeshift buckets of stones, kids who used to laugh now watched with wide eyes, no longer jeering but whispering with a kind of awe. Parents nodded respectfully instead of shooing their children away from the fragile girl. The shift was subtle but undeniable. For the first time, she wasn't fighting against mockery. She was moving in a space carved out by respect. Yet with that respect came something else: questions, expectations, even doubts disguised as curiosity. Some asked if she had exaggerated the weight, if maybe adrenaline had made her misjudge, if perhaps the man hadn't been as heavy as people claimed. She met those doubts the way she always had, not with words but with action. She kept training, kept pushing herself, not because she had to prove it again but because the act itself was part of who she was now. Strength wasn't an event. It was a practice. And the more she trained, the more she realized she wasn't just building muscle, she was building trust in herself. Every time she hoisted another weight, every time she ran another mile, she was telling herself, if the world throws another mountain at you, you will climb it. When the injured man was finally released from the hospital, he insisted on seeing her again. He came to her house with crutches, still pale but alive, and stood awkwardly on the porch until she invited him in. "I owe you more than thanks," he said, his voice trembling. "I owe you my life. I used to laugh at you like the others. I used to think size was everything. But when it mattered, you carried me. No one else could. I won't forget that." His sincerity was jarring, but she accepted it, not out of spite but because forgiveness was easier than carrying old grudges. People change when they are broken and remade, and he had been broken on that mountain, remade by her strength. In time, they became unlikely friends, bonded not by common interests but by the shared knowledge of that day, when her determination and his vulnerability had collided in a way that would mark them both forever. The community around her shifted too. She began to notice the way people stepped aside for her in the gym, offering equipment without condescension, or how her cousins no longer teased her at family gatherings, their jokes replaced with careful questions about her training. At first, she resisted the idea of becoming a symbol, but slowly she accepted that her story had given others something too, proof that strength could come in unexpected forms, that you didn't have to fit the mold to do something extraordinary. Teenagers who had once ignored her now asked for tips on endurance, younger girls looked at her with wide-eyed admiration, and even strangers online, after the story circulated beyond their town, sent messages of encouragement. She didn't reply to all of them, but she read them, and each one reminded her of the truth she had lived on that trail. Never measure someone by their frame, because inside them might be more strength than you can imagine. But beneath the recognition and praise, she held on to the quieter truth, the one no one else could fully understand, that the real victory hadn't been the weight she carried, but the fear she conquered, the relentless doubt she silenced with every step down that mountain. When she closed her eyes at night, she could still feel the crushing burden on her shoulders, still hear the blood rushing in her ears, still taste the metallic tang of desperation. But instead of haunting her, those memories steadied her. They reminded her what she was capable of when everything was stacked against her. And though people might eventually forget, though the whispers might fade, she knew she would carry that truth for the rest of her life. Weeks passed, and life threatened to settle back into routine, but routine never felt quite the same anymore. For though she still trained in the mornings, still worked her modest job, still walked the same streets of her town, everything seemed infused with a new tension, as if the universe were whispering that it wasn't finished testing her, that the mountain had been only the beginning, not the climax, and she found herself waiting for something else to happen, half dreading it, half craving the chance to prove once more that what she had done was not a fluke, not adrenaline alone, but the distilled truth of who she was becoming. The chance came on a rainy afternoon when thunder cracked across the valley and heavy rain swelled the river that cut through town. By evening, the current had turned savage, tearing at the banks, sweeping away branches and debris, and when she arrived home from work she found neighbors clustered near the bridge, shouting, panicked, pointing toward the water. A car, sleek and black, had skidded off the slick road and plunged nose first into the swollen current, the roof just barely visible as the torrent tried to drag it under. Her heart lurched as she heard the cries. There was a child trapped inside. The crowd stood frozen, some fumbling for phones, others wringing their hands, but no one moved closer to the water. The current was too strong, the rain too fierce, and fear held them in place like chains. Without thinking, without waiting for someone bigger or stronger to step forward, she tore off her jacket and splashed into the river, the cold shocking her body into sharp awareness, every nerve screaming, but she kept her eyes on the car, kept her arms churning against the pull that wanted to sweep her downstream. Voices behind her screamed warnings, begged her to stop, but she didn't stop, she couldn't, because she knew exactly what it felt like to be helpless, to wait for rescue that might not come, and she would not let that child feel it. The water was brutal, slamming her against rocks, clawing at her legs, trying to rip her from her course, but each stroke she thought of the mountain, thought of the crushing weight she had borne when no one thought she could, and that memory gave her power. She reached the half-submerged car, gasping as she grabbed hold of the door handle, but it wouldn't budge, the pressure of the river locking it tight. Inside, a little boy's terrified face pressed against the glass, his fists pounding in panic. She met his eyes, forcing her own expression into calm determination, silently telling him to hold on. With one arm braced, she reached for a jagged rock from the riverbed and smashed it against the window, once, twice, 3 times until the glass shattered inward and a rush of bubbles and muddy water exploded around them. The boy screamed, choking, as water flooded the car, but she shoved her arm through the shards, unbuckling his seatbelt with frantic fingers, and pulled him out into the freezing torrent. He clung to her with desperate strength, his small hands locking around her neck, nearly choking her, but she didn't loosen her grip. Turning, she fought toward the shore, every stroke burning as if fire lived in her muscles, the boy's weight far less than the man she had carried before, but the river's fury doubling the challenge. Twice the current spun them in circles, dragging them under, and once she smashed her shin against a hidden boulder, pain exploding white-hot, but she forced herself up again, lungs screaming for air. The voices from the bank grew louder, frantic, and then hands reached toward her as she staggered into shallower water, half dragging, half carrying the boy until arms grabbed him from her and lifted him to safety. She collapsed to her knees in the mud, coughing, shivering, hair plastered to her face, and when she looked up, the boy was crying but alive, his mother sobbing as she wrapped him in trembling arms. Around them, the crowd erupted, some shouting her name, others just staring as though they couldn't comprehend what they had seen, and she realized, shaking and soaked, that once again, no one else had moved, no one else had acted, and it had been her small frame, her stubborn heart, that had carried another life out of danger. Later that night, after the boy was safe in the hospital and she sat alone in her bedroom with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, she thought about the strange symmetry of it all. First the mountain, now the river, 2 trials that tested her in different ways but led to the same conclusion. When everyone else hesitated, she stepped forward, not because she was fearless but because she was unwilling to let fear make the choice for her. People called her brave, a hero, but she didn't feel like either. She felt human, trembling, exhausted, scarred from the rocks, her shin throbbing where bone had cracked. But beneath all of that was a clarity sharper than ever before. Strength wasn't measured in muscles or frames or expectations. It was measured in the refusal to quit when quitting would cost a life. And as the rain hammered her window, she whispered to herself a vow, that no matter how many times the world tried to test her, no matter how impossible the challenge seemed, she would step forward again, because she knew now without question. When weight needed to be carried, she was the one who could bear it. The days after the river rescue blurred into a haze of attention, gratitude, and aching pain that refused to leave her body. For though she tried to move as if everything were fine, every step sent jolts up her injured shin, every breath reminded her of bruised ribs from the rocks, and every quiet hour alone forced her to reckon with the reality that she was not invincible, that strength carried a price she could not ignore. Yet the people around her seemed blind to that part, their eyes lit with admiration and awe as though she had become something more than human, some kind of symbol they wanted to lean on. And the weight of that expectation pressed heavier on her than any mountain or river ever could. Neighbors she barely knew stopped her in the grocery store to shake her hand, to ask for stories, to tell her their children looked up to her now, and co-workers stared with a mixture of pride and disbelief, whispering that she was the strongest among them despite her frame, and she smiled politely, thanked them. But inside she felt a strange hollowness, because while they saw only the victories, she lived with the exhaustion, the nightmares of drowning, the phantom feeling of carrying dead weight again and again, and she wondered if they truly understood that none of it had been easy, that fear had clawed her throat every second, that she had nearly broken in half and only sheer stubbornness had dragged her through. Worse still, she began to notice a shift, subtle at first but growing, as though people now expected her to step forward in every crisis, as though she had forfeited the right to be ordinary, to hesitate, to be afraid. When a man collapsed outside the market one afternoon, eyes rolling back, strangers turned to her first, voices rising, "She'll know what to do." And though she knew only the barest fragments of CPR from a class years ago, she knelt anyway, pressing her hands against the man's chest, counting compressions aloud with a terror she refused to show, until paramedics arrived and took over. When a fire sparked in a neighbor's garage days later, smoke curling into the sky, people again shouted her name, expecting her to act before the firefighters even arrived, and she found herself grabbing a hose, coughing through smoke, praying the flames wouldn't trap anyone inside. Each time she stepped forward because she couldn't bear the thought of standing by, but each time she felt the cost carved deeper into her, because strength had become not just what she could do but what others demanded of her, and the thought haunted her in the dark. What if one day she failed? What if one day she wasn't fast enough, strong enough, brave enough? Would they forgive her, or would the image they'd built shatter and leave her crushed beneath the pieces? She longed for quiet, for anonymity, for the freedom to walk down the street unnoticed, but even children now pointed and whispered, mothers urging them to wave at the small woman who carried giants, and she found herself trapped in a paradox, celebrated, admired, but lonelier than she had ever been, because no one seemed to see the fragile truth beneath the legend, the bruises, the doubts, the small frame that still shook at night. Yet beneath that loneliness lived something else too, something fiercer than despair, a recognition that though she hadn't asked for this role, though it frightened her and exhausted her, there was no undoing what she had proven to herself and to the world, that her size, her limits, her fears were not the boundaries of her existence, and that perhaps being seen as unbreakable was not a curse at all, but an invitation to rise again and again, even when every bone in her body screamed otherwise. So she kept moving, kept training, kept carrying the invisible weight of expectation, whispering to herself on sleepless nights that she had carried 400 pounds of dead weight, that she had pulled life from drowning water, and that whatever came next, she would not falter, because faltering now would mean surrendering the identity she had forged in the crucible of struggle, and surrender was the one weight she refused to bear. Months rolled into seasons, and though the raw sting of bruises faded, though her leg healed and her lungs no longer burned from smoke or river water, the memory of those days carved itself into her bones, not as pain now but as a strange and steady presence, like the ghost of a storm that had once ravaged but also reshaped the land. And as she walked through her town she began to notice subtle shifts not just in how others treated her but in how she treated herself, for where once she shrank from her reflection, measuring her worth against the size of her body and the